Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you handed them the keys to your entire future, only to watch them drive away with everything you'd worked for? I'm Rebecca Martinez, and at 62 years old, I discovered that my husband of 38 years had not only been cheating on me, but had systematically stolen my pension funds to finance his affair. What he didn't know was that I had uncovered something about his precious new bride that would change everything. This is the story of how I went from broken and penniless to watching both of them lose everything they thought they'd gained. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything fell apart started like any other Tuesday, in Phoenix. I was getting ready for my shift at St. Joseph's Hospital, where I'd been a registered nurse for 35 years. The Arizona sun was already blazing through our bedroom windows in Tempe, and I was mentally preparing for another 12-hour shift in the cardiac unit. At 62, most of my colleagues were already talking about retirement, but I loved my work. Taking care of people had always been my calling, and the pension I'd built over 3.5 decades was going to ensure David and I could travel and enjoy our golden years together. I had no idea that David had been planning a very different kind of golden years for himself. David was sitting at our kitchen table when I came downstairs, still in his pajamas despite it being nearly 7 in the morning. This was unusual since he typically left for the dealership before I even woke up. Martinez Auto Group had grown from a single used car lot to 4 successful dealerships across the Phoenix metro area, and David prided himself on being the first one in the office every day. "We need to talk, Becky," he said without looking up from his coffee cup. His voice had that flat, distant tone I'd been hearing more often lately, the one that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the decades. The morning light streaming through our kitchen window illuminated the gray in his hair and the new lines around his eyes. When had we both gotten so old? When had we started looking at each other like strangers? "What's on your mind?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Over the past year, David had been increasingly distant, working longer hours, taking more business trips, and spending most evenings in his home office with the door closed. When I'd tried to talk to him about it, he'd brushed off my concerns, claiming the auto industry was more competitive than ever, and he needed to stay focused. David finally met my eyes, and what I saw there made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't anger or frustration or even sadness. It was relief, as if he'd been carrying a burden he was finally ready to set down. "I want a divorce," he said simply, as if he were commenting on the weather. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gripped the edge of the table to steady myself, coffee sloshing in my cup. "What did you say?" "I said I want a divorce. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'll be moving out this weekend." I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke or a temporary breakdown brought on by stress. We'd had our difficulties over the years. What couple didn't after nearly 4 decades together? But divorce? The word felt foreign, impossible, like he'd suddenly started speaking a different language. "David, where is this coming from? We can work through whatever's bothering you. We can go to counseling. We can take a vacation. There's someone else," he interrupted. And those 3 words shattered what remained of my composure. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Someone else?" "Her name is Amanda Chen. We've been seeing each other for 18 months. He delivered this information with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss quarterly sales figures. "I'm sorry, Becky, but what we have isn't enough anymore. Amanda makes me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible." 18 months. While I'd been working double shifts to help boost our retirement savings, while I'd been planning our upcoming anniversary trip to Ireland, while I'd been caring for his elderly mother during her final illness just 6 months ago, David had been building a life with another woman. Who is she? I managed to whisper. She's a life coach. We met at a business networking event. She's helped me realize that I've been living someone else's life for too long. His voice took on an almost evangelical fervor as he spoke about this Amanda person. She's shown me that it's never too late to pursue genuine happiness. I wanted to scream that I'd thought I was his genuine happiness. I wanted to remind him of all the years I'd supported his dreams, all the sacrifices I'd made while he built his business empire. Instead, I heard myself asking, does Jessica know? Our daughter Jessica lived in Chandler with her husband Ryan, and their 8-year-old daughter Lily. She was the center of our world, the glue that had held our family together through difficult times. Surely David wouldn't have told our daughter about this affair before telling me. David's expression grew uncomfortable. I introduced Amanda to Jessica and Ryan last month. They had dinner together. The betrayal doubled, then tripled. Not only had David been cheating on me for a year and a half, but he'd brought this woman into our family circle, had our daughter approve of her, all while I remained completely oblivious. Last month, when I was visiting Carol in Tucson, he nodded, and I realized that my sister's invitation for a girls' weekend had been perfectly timed to give David the opportunity to parade his mistress in front of our daughter. How could you do this to us? The question came out broken, barely audible. Becky, our marriage has been over for years. We're more like roommates than husband and wife. We sleep in separate bedrooms. We barely talk beyond discussing household logistics. Amanda has reminded me what passion feels like. I stared at this man I'd loved since I was 24 years old. We'd met when I was a new nurse at Phoenix General, and he was working at his father's small garage, dreaming of expanding into auto sales. I'd believed in his vision, had worked extra shifts to help finance his first dealership, had postponed my own dreams of traveling and furthering my education so he could build his empire. Yes, we'd grown apart over the years. Yes, we'd fallen into routines that prioritized practical concerns over romance. But I'd thought that was normal for a long-term marriage. I'd thought we were building toward something, working together toward a shared future where we could finally focus on each other once the pressures of career and child-rearing were behind us. I need you to sign these papers, David said, sliding a manila folder across the table. My lawyer drew up a preliminary agreement. I think you'll find the terms more than fair. With trembling hands, I opened the folder and tried to focus on the legal language swimming before my eyes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I saw made my blood run cold. David was offering me a modest monthly alimony payment, my car, and my personal belongings. Everything else, the house we'd lived in for 20 years, the dealerships I'd helped him build, the investment accounts we'd accumulated together, would remain his. What about my pension? I asked, flipping through pages that seemed to make no mention of the retirement funds I'd been contributing to for 35 years. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's complicated. Since it's in your name, obviously it's yours, but there have been some financial challenges with the business lately. I had to make some temporary borrowings from various accounts to keep the dealerships afloat. The words hit me like ice water. What kind of borrowings? It's all documented. My accountant can explain the details. The important thing is that the business is solid now, and you'll be repaid with interest once some pending deals close. I felt the room spinning around me. David, you borrowed from my pension without telling me? I borrowed from our joint assets to save our livelihood. I didn't think you'd want to see 30 years of hard work go down the drain because of a temporary cash flow problem. How much? My voice was barely a whisper. About $400,000. I gripped the table so hard my knuckles went white. $400,000. Nearly my entire retirement savings. Money I'd worked 3 decades to accumulate. Money that represented security and freedom and the ability to care for myself in my old age. "You stole my pension to finance your affair," I said, the words coming out flat and cold. "I didn't steal anything. I borrowed from joint marital assets to save our business. The fact that Amanda and I found each other during a difficult period doesn't change the financial realities we were facing." The casual way he linked his theft of my retirement funds to his affair made me realize that this man I'd loved and trusted for 38 years was essentially a stranger. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs that the person I'd built my life around was capable of such calculated betrayal? "I need to get to work," I said, standing on unsteady legs. "I can't process this right now." "Take your time." "To review the papers. My lawyer recommends you get your own attorney, though I think you'll find the settlement quite reasonable considering the circumstances." Considering the circumstances. As if my husband's infidelity and theft were natural. Disasters I should be grateful to survive, rather than betrayals that had destroyed my sense of security and trust. I drove to the hospital in a fog, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Twice I had to pull over because tears were blurring my vision too badly to see the road. How was I supposed to care for patients when my own world was collapsing? How? Was I supposed to smile and offer comfort when I felt like I was drowning? My supervisor, Patricia Wilson, took one look at me when I arrived and immediately pulled me aside. Pat had been my closest friend at the hospital for over 20 years. She'd seen me through Jessica's difficult teenage years, through David's, mother's long illness, through every crisis and celebration of my adult life. "Honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I found myself telling her everything, the words pouring out in a rush of anger and disbelief. Pat listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. $400,000, she finally said. "Becky, that's not borrowing, that's theft. And doing it to finance an affair makes it even worse." His lawyer made it sound like it was all legal, like I should be grateful for the settlement he's offering. Pat shook her head firmly. "You need your own lawyer, and you need one today. Don't sign anything until you've had independent legal advice. Promise me." I promised, though part of me wondered what the point was. David controlled all our finances, knew every detail of our assets and investments. What could a lawyer do except charge me money I didn't have to confirm that my husband had outmaneuvered me completely? That evening, I sat alone in our living room, staring at the divorce papers spread across the coffee table. David had gone to a business dinner, though I now realized he was probably with Amanda, celebrating their freedom to be together openly. I thought about calling Jessica, but what would I say? "Your father has been cheating on me for 18 months and stole my pension to pay for it, but he introduced his mistress to you last month, and you seemed fine with it?" Instead, I called my sister Carol in Tucson. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the TV in the background. "Becky, how are you, honey? You sound terrible." Once again, I found myself telling the story, watching my marriage and my financial security crumble with each word I spoke. Carol listened with growing outrage, interrupting occasionally with colorful observations about David's character that I'd never heard her express before. "I never trusted him completely," she admitted when I finished. "He always seemed too smooth, too focused on appearances, but I never imagined he'd do something like this to you." "What am I going to do, Carol? I'm 62 years old. My pension is gone. I don't have enough savings to hire a good lawyer or support myself if David throws me out of the house. First, you're going to get a lawyer like Pat suggested. Second, you're going to fight this with everything you've got. And third, you're going to remember that you're stronger than you think you are. You've been taking care of people your whole life, Becky. Now it's time to take care of yourself." After we hung up, I walked through the house David and I had shared for 20 years, seeing it with new eyes. The furniture we'd chosen together, the photos documenting our life as a family, the garden I'd spent countless hours cultivating. Had any of it been real? Had David been planning his escape even as we were building what I thought was our forever home? I found myself in David's home office, a room I'd rarely entered since he'd claimed it needed to be private for business purposes. His computer was locked, but his filing cabinets weren't. I told myself I was looking for financial documents I'd need for my lawyer, but really, I was searching for answers, for some explanation of how my life had turned into a nightmare overnight. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Credit card. Statements showing expensive dinners for two at restaurants David had never taken me to. Hotel receipts from weekend getaways I'd known nothing about. Jewelry store receipts for items I'd never received. For 18 months, David had been living a double life, financing his romance with Amanda, while telling me we needed to be more careful with spending. But it was the bank statements that truly staggered me. Regular transfers from our joint accounts to a savings account I'd never heard of. Withdrawals from my pension account that David had managed through a power of attorney I'd signed years earlier when he'd convinced me he could get better investment returns than the hospital's standard plan. The scope of the financial manipulation was breathtaking. David hadn't just stolen my pension in a moment of desperation. He'd been systematically moving our assets for over a year, preparing for this divorce while I remained completely unaware of his plans. I sat in his leather chair, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, and felt something shift inside me. The shock and grief were still there, but underneath them was growing a cold, determined anger. David thought he'd been clever, thought he'd arranged everything to his advantage while leaving me powerless to fight back. He was about to learn that he'd underestimated the woman who'd stood by him for 38 years. I might be 62 years old, and I might be facing the destruction of everything I'd worked for, but I wasn't going down without a fight. As I gathered the financial documents I'd need for my lawyer, I began to formulate a plan. David had spent months preparing for this divorce, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I would accept his version of events without question, just as I'd accepted his business decisions and financial management throughout our marriage. But I was done being the trusting, supportive wife who asked no questions and made no demands. If David wanted to play hardball, I was ready to show him that 3.5 decades of nursing had taught me a thing or two about fighting for what mattered. Tomorrow, I would find the best divorce attorney I could afford and begin the battle for my financial survival. But tonight, I would start researching Amanda Chen, the woman who thought she'd won the prize of my husband and his money. Something told me that David's precious life coach had secrets of her own, and I intended to find every single one of them. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My supervisor, Pat, understood immediately when I explained that I needed time to find legal representation and begin protecting what remained of my assets. She even recommended James Foster, a divorce attorney who had helped her sister through a messy separation 5 years earlier. James Foster's office was located in a gleaming high-rise in downtown Phoenix, and as I sat in the elegant waiting room, I felt completely out of my depth. The other clients looked polished and wealthy, while I sat there in my best work clothes, clutching a folder of financial documents and trying not to let my anxiety show. When Foster finally called me into his office, I was struck by how young he looked. I'd expected someone older, more paternal, but this man couldn't have been more than 45. His handshake was firm, though, and his eyes were kind as he gestured for me to sit across from his mahogany desk. "Tell me what's happening, Mrs. Martinez," he said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. I launched into the story again, and with each telling, it became more real and more devastating. Foster took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts. When I reached the part about David draining my pension, his eyebrows shot up. $400,000 from your retirement account? And you had no knowledge of these withdrawals? None whatsoever. David always handled our finances. He said it was more efficient since he had the business background. I trusted him completely. Foster set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Martinez, what your husband did was not just morally reprehensible, it was likely illegal. Taking money from a spouse's retirement account without their knowledge or consent, especially to finance an extramarital affair, constitutes theft and possibly fraud. For the first time since David had dropped his bombshell, I felt a flicker of hope. Does that mean I can get my money back? It means we have grounds to fight and fight hard, but I need to be honest with you about what we're up against. Your husband owns a successful business and has clearly been planning this divorce for some time. He'll have excellent legal representation, and he's structured things to his advantage. Foster pulled out a calculator and began running numbers, based on the financial documents I'd brought. After several minutes, he looked up with a grim expression. Based on what you've shown me, your husband has managed to move approximately $700,000 in joint assets into accounts or investments that he'll claim are business-related or premarital property. The pension theft is the most egregious violation, but it's not the only financial manipulation that's occurred. $700,000. The number hit me like a sledgehammer. I'd had no idea we possessed that much in liquid assets, which meant I'd had no idea how much David was stealing from our future. What are my options? I asked, my voice barely steady. We fight on multiple fronts. First, we demand a full forensic accounting of all marital assets going back 5 years. Second, we file criminal charges for the unauthorized pension withdrawals. Third, we investigate whether any of these transferred funds were used to purchase assets for the girlfriend. The word girlfriend made my stomach clench. Amanda wasn't just some random woman David had met. She was the beneficiary of my stolen retirement money, wearing jewelry and taking vacations paid for with the security I'd spent decades building. How much will this cost? I asked, dreading the answer. My retainer is $15,000, and a case this complex could easily run to $50,000 or more in legal fees. But Mrs. Martinez, if we're successful, we could recover significantly more than that. $15,000. I had maybe $8,000 in my personal checking account, money I'd saved from working overtime shifts. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's theft had left me unable to afford the legal help I needed to fight his theft. I can't afford that kind of money, I admitted, embarrassed by my financial vulnerability. Foster studied me for a long moment. Let me make some calls. I know attorneys who work on contingency for cases involving financial fraud. If your husband has hidden as many assets as I suspect, this could be worth their while. 3 days. Later, I found myself in the office of Margaret Chen, no relation to David's Amanda, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. Margaret was a tiny woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the demeanor of a pit bull. Her office walls were covered with certificates and awards, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd been winning battles for decades. I've reviewed your case, Rebecca, and I'm willing to take it on contingency. 30% of whatever we recover above what your husband initially offered. It felt like making a deal with the devil, but what choice did I have? If I didn't fight, I'd be left with almost nothing. If I did fight and lost, I'd be in the same position. But if Margaret could prove David had been stealing from me systematically, I might salvage something from the wreckage of my marriage. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything. Every bank statement, credit card bill, tax return, and financial document you can find. Also, I need you to start documenting your husband's lifestyle over the past 2 years. Where has he been traveling? What has he been buying? Who has he been spending time with? That evening, I began what would become my obsession for the next several weeks. I turned into a detective investigating my own life, combing through years of financial records with the methodical precision I'd learned from 35 years of medical charting. What emerged was a pattern of deception so extensive it took my breath away. David hadn't just been unfaithful for 18 months. The evidence suggested he'd been systematically moving money for over 2 years, long before he claimed to have reconnected with Amanda. I found records of cash withdrawals totaling thousands of dollars each month, supposedly for business expenses that were never documented. Credit card charges at expensive restaurants in Scottsdale during times when David claimed to be visiting, dealers in Tucson, hotel bills for luxury resorts during weekends when he'd told me he was attending industry conferences. Most damning of all, I discovered that David had opened a joint checking account with Amanda Chen 6 months ago. The account showed regular deposits from our business accounts and withdrawals for everything from apartment rent to car payments to jewelry purchases. As I compiled this evidence, I felt my grief transforming into something sharper and more focused. David hadn't just fallen out of love with me and into love with someone else. He'd systematically planned my financial destruction while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband. But the more I researched Amanda Chen, the more questions I had about David's precious life coach. Her LinkedIn profile claimed she'd been running a successful coaching practice for 5 years, but I could find no evidence of an actual business license or client testimonials. Her website was professionally designed but vague about her qualifications or methodology. I spent hours scrolling through Amanda's social media profiles, studying photos of her perfectly curated life. She posted constantly about mindfulness, abundance, and living authentically, often from expensive restaurants or luxury hotel lobbies. For someone who preached about finding inner peace, she seemed remarkably focused on material wealth and status, symbols. One evening, while David was out at another supposed business dinner, I decided to dig deeper into Amanda's background. I'd learned enough about online research to know how to find public records, court documents, and business filings. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Amanda Chen had been married 3 times before. Her first marriage, to a software engineer named Robert Kim, had ended in divorce after 2 years. Public records showed that Robert had filed for bankruptcy 6 months after their divorce, claiming his ex-wife had run up massive debts on joint credit cards. Her second marriage, to a restaurant owner named Michael Torres, had lasted 3 years. That divorce had been contentious, with Michael accusing Amanda of embezzling from his business and forging his signature on loan documents. The case had been settled out of court, but Michael's restaurant had closed within a year of their separation. Most recently, Amanda had been married to Dr. Richard Lawson, a successful plastic surgeon in Scottsdale. Their divorce had been finalized just 18 months ago, around the time David claimed he'd reconnected with Amanda. The settlement had been substantial, with Amanda receiving alimony, half of their joint assets, and the condo where she currently lived. I sat back in my chair, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Amanda wasn't just a life coach who'd happened to fall in love with my husband. She was a professional predator who targeted successful, wealthy men and systematically drained their assets before moving on to the next victim. David thought he was having a passionate affair with a woman who understood his need for authenticity and excitement. In reality, he was being methodically fleeced by someone who'd perfected the art of financial manipulation through romance. The question was what to do with this information. I could confront David, but would he believe me? He was clearly infatuated with Amanda and convinced that she represented his path to happiness. Even if I could prove her history of deception, would it matter to a man who'd already shown he was willing to steal from his wife to finance his fantasy? I called Margaret Chen the next morning and shared what I'd discovered about Amanda's marital history. "This is gold," Margaret said immediately. "If we can prove that your husband's girlfriend has a pattern of targeting wealthy men and depleting their assets, it strengthens our case enormously. It shows that the money he stole from you wasn't just financing an affair, it was funding an ongoing criminal enterprise." Should I tell David what I've found? Absolutely not. Right now, Amanda probably sees your husband as a long-term project. If she realizes we're investigating her, she might accelerate her timeline and disappear with whatever money she's already extracted. We want to catch her in the act, not chase her after she's gone. Margaret's words sent a chill through me. David thought he was starting a new life with a woman who loved him for himself. In reality, He was being systematically robbed by someone who viewed him as nothing more than a bank account with legs. Part of me felt a twisted satisfaction at the thought of David discovering Amanda's true nature. After what he'd done to me, he deserved whatever heartbreak and financial devastation she brought him. But another part of me, the part that had loved him for 38 years, felt sick at the thought of him being victimized the same way he'd victimized me. That weekend, David moved out of our house and into Amanda's condo in Scottsdale. He'd hired movers to pack his belongings while I was at work, and I came home to find half-empty closets and bare walls where his pictures used to hang. On the kitchen counter, he'd left a note written in his careful handwriting. "Becky, I know this is difficult, but I hope you'll come to understand that this is best for both of us. We both deserve to be happy, and happiness isn't something we can give each other anymore. I'll always care about you and appreciate the years we had together." The note was so typical of David, presenting his betrayal and theft as a generous gift he was giving me. Even in leaving, he couldn't acknowledge the devastation he'd caused or take responsibility for his choices. I crumpled up the note and threw it away, then walked through our suddenly empty house. 3 decades of marriage reduced to vacant rooms and indentations in the carpet where furniture used to sit. David had taken his home office furniture, his tools from the garage, and even the coffee maker we'd received as a wedding gift. But he'd left behind his old computer, the one he'd replaced 6 months ago with a sleek new laptop. As I stood in the doorway of his former office, I realized he might have forgotten about the files stored on that old hard drive. That evening, I plugged in David's abandoned computer and waited for it to boot up. It was password protected, but I knew David well enough to guess his typical passwords. After 3 tries, his birthday followed by his father's initials, I was in. What I found on that computer changed everything. David's email history going back 3 years painted a picture of calculated deception that was even worse than I'd imagined. He hadn't just met Amanda 18 months ago at a networking event. They'd been corresponding for over 2 years, and their relationship had been transactional from the beginning. The earliest emails showed Amanda offering David business coaching services, helping him maximize his potential and break free from limiting beliefs. But within weeks, the coaching had become personal, with Amanda encouraging David to examine whether his marriage was holding him back from achieving his dreams. "Successful men like you deserve partners who enhance their lives rather than drain their energy," she'd written in one early email. "Sometimes we have to make difficult choices to align our external circumstances with our internal truth." As their correspondence continued, Amanda had gradually convinced David that his marriage to me was not just unfulfilling, but actively harmful to his success and well-being. She'd positioned herself as his salvation, the woman who could help him become the man he was meant to be. But it was the financial emails that truly revealed Amanda's game. Over the course of their relationship, she'd systematically identified David's assets and encouraged him to move money into accounts she could access. She'd convinced him to list her as a beneficiary on several investment accounts, claiming it was a symbol of his commitment to their future together. Most shocking of all, I found emails discussing their post-divorce plans. Amanda had already researched David's business assets and was planning to convince him to make her a partner in Martinez Auto Group. She'd identified properties she wanted him to purchase for their new life together, and she'd even researched expensive cars she wanted him to buy for her. David thought he was planning a romantic future with the woman of his dreams. Amanda was planning to systematically strip him of every asset he possessed, just as she'd done to her 3 previous husbands. I printed out the most damning emails and added them to the growing file of evidence Margaret and I were building. But as I read through David's pathetic expressions of love and gratitude for Amanda's guidance, I felt something unexpected: pity. My husband was an idiot and a thief who destroyed our marriage and stolen my financial security. But he was also a victim, being manipulated by someone far more calculating and ruthless than he could ever imagine. The question was whether I should warn him or let him discover Amanda's true nature the same way I'd discovered his, through devastating betrayal that would leave him broken and financially ruined. As I sat in our empty house, surrounded by evidence of deception and fraud, I realized I was facing a choice that would define not just my financial future, but who I wanted to be as a person. I could use what I'd learned to destroy both David and Amanda, or I could find a way to protect myself while letting justice take its natural course. Either way, I was done being the victim in this story. David and Amanda thought they'd outmaneuvered me, but they had no idea what a woman with nothing left to lose was capable of achieving. The real battle was just beginning. 2 weeks after David moved out, I received a phone call that changed everything. Margaret Chen had been working with a forensic accountant to trace the movement of our assets, and what they'd discovered was even more extensive than we'd initially suspected. "Rebecca, you need to sit down for this," Margaret said when I answered the phone. "We've uncovered evidence that your husband has been systematically hiding assets for over 3 years, not 2. The total amount we're talking about is closer to $1.2 million. $1.2 million. The number was so staggering I couldn't process it. I'd known David's business was successful, but I'd had no idea we'd accumulated that kind of wealth. More importantly, I'd had no idea that David had been methodically stealing it from our future. How is that possible? I would have noticed transfers that large. He was clever about it. Small amounts moved regularly, disguised as business expenses or investment transfers. But when you add it up over 3 years, plus the growth from investments he's made with your money, it's substantial. Margaret explained that David had created a complex web of business accounts, shell companies, and investment portfolios that would be difficult to trace without professional help. He'd even purchased real estate in Amanda's name using money from our joint accounts, claiming the properties were business investments. The good news is that we have documented evidence of every transfer. The bad news is that unwinding this financial maze is going to take time, and your husband's attorney is fighting us every step of the way. David's lawyer had filed motions, claiming that I was attempting to interfere with legitimate business operations, and that my accusations of theft were vindictive lies from a bitter ex-wife. They were portraying me as a woman scorned who was making false accusations to gain leverage in the divorce settlement. What about the criminal charges for the pension theft? That's moving forward, but slowly. The district attorney's office is interested, especially given the amounts involved, but they want to see our full financial analysis before deciding whether to prosecute. After hanging up with Margaret, I sat in my kitchen trying to absorb the magnitude of what David had done. This wasn't just a man having an affair and making poor financial decisions. This was calculated fraud spanning years, involving amounts of money that could have set us both up for a comfortable retirement. Instead, I was living in a house I could no longer afford, working double shifts at 62 years old, and facing legal bills that threatened to consume what little savings I had left. That evening, my daughter Jessica called. I hadn't spoken to her since David had moved out, and I'd been dreading this conversation. Jessica had always been closer to her father, admiring his business success and charismatic personality. How would she react to learning that her beloved dad was a thief and a fraud? "Mom, I think we need to talk," Jessica said without preamble. "Dad told me about the divorce, and I've been trying to process everything." "What did he tell you?" I asked carefully. "He said you two had grown apart and that you were having trouble accepting his relationship with Amanda. He made it sound like you were being unreasonable about the financial settlement." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar sting of David's ability to manipulate the narrative. Even in destroying our marriage, he was managing to position himself as the reasonable party and me as the difficult one. "Jessica, there are things you don't know about the situation. Your father didn't just leave me for another woman. He stole $400,000 from my pension account to finance their relationship." Silence on the other end of the line. Then Jessica's voice, smaller and uncertain. "What do you mean, stole?" I explained everything. The unauthorized withdrawals from my retirement account, the hidden transfers of joint assets, the systematic financial manipulation that had been going on for years. Jessica listened without interrupting, but I could hear her sharp intakes of breath as the scope of her father's deception became clear. "Mom, are you sure about this? Dad's always been so careful with money, so responsible. This doesn't sound like him." "I have bank statements, Jessica. I have email records. I have documentation from forensic accountants. Your father has been systematically stealing from our marriage for years to build a new life with Amanda. But he introduced me to Amanda months ago. She seemed so nice, so genuine. She was asking about you, saying she hoped you two could eventually be friends." The manipulation was even more extensive than I'd realized. Amanda had been working on Jessica, probably gathering information about our family dynamics and financial situation while presenting herself as a caring woman who wanted everyone to get along. "Jessica, Amanda isn't who you think she is. She's been married 3 times before, and each marriage ended with her ex-husband being financially ruined. She's a professional predator who targets successful men." "Mom, that's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" I did have proof, but how? Could I explain to my daughter that I'd been conducting surveillance on her father's girlfriend? How could I tell her that the woman who'd been so charming during their dinner together was actively planning to destroy David financially? I've been researching her background, and the pattern is clear. She finds wealthy men, convinces them to leave their wives, gains access to their assets, and then disappears when she's extracted everything she can. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was strained. "This is crazy, Mom. A week ago, I thought you and Dad were going through a normal divorce, and now you're telling me Dad's a thief and his girlfriend is some kind of criminal mastermind." "I know how it sounds. But Jessica, I need you to understand that I'm not making this up out of bitterness or anger. I'm trying to protect what's left of our family's assets and figure out how to survive financially." "What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between us. What did I want from Jessica? Did I want her to confront her father? Did I want her to cut ties with Amanda? Did I want her to choose sides in a battle that was becoming more vicious by the day? "I want you to be careful," I said finally. "I want you to protect yourself and Ryan and Lily from getting caught up in this mess. And I want you to know that whatever happens between your father and me, I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." After we hung up, I felt more alone than ever. David had Amanda and his fantasy of a new life. Jessica was trying to stay neutral in a situation that didn't allow for neutrality. I had my lawyers and my growing pile of evidence, but I was facing this battle essentially alone. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called David's office and asked to speak with him directly. "Becky?" He sounded shocked to hear from me. "Is everything okay?" "I want to meet with you and Amanda. All 3 of us together. There are things we need to discuss." "I don't think that's a good idea. My lawyer advised me not to have direct contact with you while the divorce is pending." "This isn't about the divorce, David. This is about protecting you from making a terrible mistake." "What are you talking about?" "Meet me at the Starbucks on Camelback Road tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Bring Amanda. If you don't show up, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with adrenaline. I had no idea if David would actually show up, but I needed to look Amanda in the eye when I revealed what I knew about her. That evening, I prepared for the confrontation like a general planning a battle. I printed out copies of Amanda's divorce records, the emails from David's computer, and the financial documents showing how she'd systematically gained access to our assets. I also printed out information about her 3 previous husbands and the financial devastation they'd suffered after their marriages to her ended. If David wanted to destroy his life for this woman, he was going to do it with full knowledge of who she really was. I arrived at the Starbucks 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. At exactly 2 o'clock, David walked through the door with Amanda beside him. She was even more beautiful in person than in her. Social media photos with long dark hair and an elegant way of moving that commanded attention. David looked nervous as they approached my table, but Amanda seemed completely composed, almost amused by the situation. She extended her hand to me with a warm smile. "Rebecca, I'm so glad to finally meet you. David has told me so much about you. I hope we can find a way to navigate this transition that works for everyone." Her voice was smooth and professional, with just the right note of concern and empathy. If I hadn't known what I knew about her history, I might have been charmed by her apparent sincerity. "Thank you for coming," I said, not taking her offered hand. "Please sit down. There are some things we need to discuss." David and Amanda sat across from me, and I could see David's confusion about why I'd requested this meeting. Amanda's expression remained pleasantly neutral, but I caught a flicker of wariness in her eyes. "David," I began, "before you finalize this divorce and commit to a new life with Amanda, I think you should know some facts about her background." "Becky, whatever you're planning to say, please don't," David said. "I know you're hurt, but attacking Amanda isn't going to change anything." "I'm not attacking anyone. I'm sharing information that I believe you have a right to know." I pulled out the folder I'd prepared and placed it on the table between us. "Amanda, would you like to tell David about your 3 previous marriages, or should I?" For the first time, Amanda's composure cracked slightly. Her smile faltered, and she glanced at David with what looked like genuine concern. "David and I have discussed my past relationships," she said carefully. "I've been honest with him about my previous marriages." "Have you told him about Robert Kim, who filed for bankruptcy 6 months after your divorce? Or Michael Torres, who accused you of embezzling from his restaurant? Or Dr. Richard Lawson, who you left just 18 months ago with half his assets?" David was staring at Amanda with growing alarm. "Amanda, what is she talking about?" "These are lies, David. Your ex-wife is obviously bitter about our relationship, and she's trying to sabotage our happiness with false accusations." I opened the folder and pulled out copies of the divorce records. "These are public documents, Amanda. Court filings, bankruptcy records, business closure notices. Your 3 ex-husbands have lost a combined total of over $2 million after their relationships with you ended." David took the papers and began reading, his face growing pale as he absorbed the information. Amanda watched him with increasing desperation. "David, you can't believe this. She's obviously hired someone to manufacture evidence. This is exactly the kind of vindictive behavior that drove you away from her in the first place. These records show that you convinced Dr. Lawson to invest in a series of business ventures that turned out to be fraudulent," I continued. "You had him transfer money to accounts you controlled, supposedly for real estate investments that never materialized." "That's not true. Richard made poor investment decisions, and he's trying to blame me for his failures." I pulled out another set of documents. "These are emails from David's computer, showing how you've been systematically identifying his assets and encouraging him to move money into accounts you can access. You've already convinced him to list you as a beneficiary on several investment accounts." David looked up from the divorce records with an expression of dawning horror. "Amanda, is this true? Have you been researching my financial situation?" "Of course I know about your finances, David. We're planning a life together. It's natural for couples to discuss their assets and plan for their future. But these emails make it sound like you've been calculating exactly how much money you can extract from our relationship." Amanda's mask was slipping completely now. The warm, empathetic life coach was being replaced by someone colder and more calculating. "David, you're letting her manipulate you. She's taking normal relationship conversations and twisting them to make me look like some kind of criminal. This is exactly what she did throughout your marriage, isn't it?" making you doubt yourself, making you question your own judgment. It was a masterful deflection, turning my accusations back on me and positioning herself as David's protector against my manipulation. For a moment, I saw doubt creep back into David's expression. "There's more," I said, pulling out the final set of documents. "These are financial records showing that you've already transferred over $300,000 to Amanda, or to accounts she controls. Money that came from my pension, from our joint savings, from business accounts that were supposed to be for company operations." David stared at the bank statements showing transfers to Amanda's accounts, payments for her condo, deposits for a car lease in her name. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "You've been stealing from me to pay for her lifestyle," I said quietly. "For 3 years, you've been systematically moving our assets to fund her expenses while telling me we needed to be more careful with spending." Amanda stood up abruptly, her composure finally completely shattered. "I don't have to listen to this. David, if you choose to believe her lies over our love, then maybe we don't have the kind of relationship I thought we did." She turned to leave, but David caught her arm. "Amanda, wait. I need to understand what's happening here. Are these documents accurate? Have you been married 3 times before?" "My past relationships are none of her business," Amanda snapped. "The question is whether you trust me or whether you're going to let your bitter ex-wife destroy our happiness." "Answer the question," David said, his voice harder than I'd heard it in years. "Were you married to Dr. Richard Lawson 18 months ago?" Amanda looked between David and me, calculating her options. Finally, she seemed to realize that denial was no longer possible. "Yes, I was married to Richard. And yes, our divorce was contentious. But that doesn't mean I'm some kind of criminal. Relationships end, David. Sometimes they end badly." "What? About the money? The transfers to your accounts? You wanted to take care of me. You wanted to show your commitment to our relationship. I never forced you to do anything." David was staring at Amanda as if seeing her for the first time. The woman he'd sacrificed his marriage for, the woman he'd stolen from me to support, was revealing herself to be exactly what my research had suggested: a professional predator who viewed relationships as business transactions. "I need some time to think," David said finally. "I need to process all of this. David, if you walk away from me now, I won't be here when you change your mind," Amanda said. "I deserve better than to be accused and interrogated like some kind of criminal." She gathered her purse and walked out of the Starbucks, leaving David and me sitting across from each other in stunned silence. The man who had destroyed our marriage to be with his soulmate was now facing the possibility that his soulmate was a fraud who had been manipulating him from the beginning. "Is it all true?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every word. I've been investigating her for weeks, David. I know about her pattern of targeting wealthy men. I know about the financial devastation she's left in her wake, and I know about her plans for your business." David buried his face in his hands. My God, what have I done? For a moment, I felt a flash of the old tenderness I'd once had for this man. He looked broken, defeated, like a child who'd just learned that his hero was actually a villain. "You fell for someone who's very good at what she does," I said. "Amanda is a professional, David. She's spent years perfecting the art of making men fall in love with her while she robs them blind." "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked, looking up with tears in his eyes. The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. David had stolen from me, lied to me, and destroyed our marriage for a fantasy that had turned out to be a nightmare. But seeing him broken and humiliated, I realized that my anger had evolved into something more complex. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But right now, we need to focus on limiting the damage. How much money has Amanda taken?" "I don't know exactly, Maybe 400,000, maybe more. She convinced me to invest in several business opportunities that I'm starting to realize might not exist. $400,000 on top of what he'd already stolen from me. The scope of the financial devastation was staggering. David, you need to contact your bank immediately. Cancel any accounts she has access to, revoke any powers of attorney you've given her, and freeze any investments you've made on her advice. What if she disappears with everything? She probably will. That seems to be her pattern when her victims start asking questions. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. David had destroyed our marriage and stolen my financial security for a woman who had been planning to destroy him financially. The irony was almost too bitter to comprehend. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now you learn what I've been learning for the past 2 months. You figure out how to rebuild your life after someone you trusted completely betrays you. The difference is that I'm going to get my money back, even if I have to take you to court to do it." As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. The confrontation was over. The truth was out, and Amanda's carefully constructed facade had crumbled under the weight of evidence. David would have to face the consequences of his choices, just as I was facing the consequences of my trust. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was holding the cards instead of being played by someone else's game. The real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning, but I was no longer doing it from a position of ignorance and powerlessness. I knew exactly what I was fighting for and exactly what I was fighting against, and I was going to win. 3 days after the confrontation at Starbucks, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was David, and he sounded panicked. "Becky, she's gone. Amanda's gone, and I think she's taken everything." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What do you mean? Gone?" "I went to her condo yesterday to try to talk to her, and the building manager said she'd moved out 2 days ago. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. I've been trying to check our joint accounts, and most of them have been emptied." Despite everything David had done to me, I felt a stab of sympathy for the devastation in his voice. Amanda had played her final card exactly as I'd predicted she would. When her cover was blown, she'd cut her losses and disappeared with whatever money she could access. "How much did she take?" "I don't know yet. I'm at the bank now, but it looks like it could be close to $600,000. Maybe more." $600,000. Added to the $400,000 David had stolen from my pension, Amanda had managed to extract over $1 million from our family's assets before vanishing into thin air. "David, you need to call the police immediately. This is theft on a massive scale." "I already did. They're treating it as a fraud case, but the detective told me that since I gave Amanda access to the accounts voluntarily, it's going to be difficult to prove criminal intent." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. David was experiencing exactly what I'd been going through for months: the helpless feeling of watching someone you trusted steal your financial security while hiding behind legal technicalities. "What about the investments she convinced you to make?" "Those are gone too. The companies she directed me to invest in don't exist. The addresses are fake, the phone numbers are disconnected. It was all an elaborate scam." I closed my eyes, processing the magnitude of the disaster. Amanda hadn't just stolen money from David's accounts. She'd convinced him to voluntarily transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars to fraudulent investment schemes. The woman was even more sophisticated than I'd realized. "Have you told Jessica?" "Not yet. I don't know how to explain this to her. How do I tell my daughter that I destroyed our family for a woman who was robbing me blind?" "You tell her the truth, David. She deserves to know what happened." After hanging up with David, I called Margaret Chen to update her on Amanda's disappearance. Margaret's reaction was swift and strategic. "This actually helps our case enormously," she said. "Now we can prove that your husband wasn't just having an affair. He was being systematically defrauded by a professional criminal. It strengthens our argument that the money he took from your pension was stolen under false pretenses. But the money's still gone. Even if we can prove David was being scammed, Amanda has disappeared with over $1 million. Not necessarily. I'm going to work with the fraud investigators to trace Amanda's movements and assets. Professional con artists like her usually have established patterns for hiding money. She may have taken your husband's cash, but she's probably left a trail we can follow. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Richard Lawson, Amanda's most recent ex-husband. He'd been contacted by the police as part of their investigation into Amanda's disappearance, and he wanted to speak with me directly. Mrs. Martinez, I understand you're dealing with the same situation I went through 2 years ago, Dr. Lawson said when we met for coffee. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, impeccably dressed but with tired eyes that spoke of hard-won experience. Amanda took you for a substantial amount as well? $800,000 before I finally realized what was happening. She convinced me to invest in real estate deals that turned out to be complete fabrications. By the time I discovered the truth, she'd already filed for divorce and disappeared with the money. Dr. Lawson explained that Amanda's method was always the same. She'd identify successful, emotionally vulnerable men and position herself as their salvation. She'd encourage them to make dramatic life changes, including leaving their wives, while systematically gaining access to their assets. The genius of her approach is that she makes her victims complicit in their own destruction, Dr. Lawson continued. She never steals money outright. She convinces men to give it to her voluntarily, usually by framing it as an investment in their shared future. Did you ever get any of your money back? Dr. Lawson shook his head grimly. Nothing. She'd covered her tracks too well. The money had been transferred through so many shell companies and offshore accounts that tracing it was impossible. Then why are you telling me this? If there's no hope of recovery, what's the point? Because this time might be different. Amanda made a mistake with your husband that she didn't make with me or her other victims. What kind of mistake? She got greedy. Usually, Amanda spends 2 or 3 years slowly extracting money from her targets before disappearing. With your husband, she accelerated her timeline because of your investigation. That kind of rushed exit often leaves loose ends. Dr. Lawson had been working with a private investigator to track Amanda's activities since his own financial disaster. They'd identified patterns in her behavior and discovered that she wasn't working alone. Amanda has a partner, a man named Stephen Walsh, who helps her set up the fraudulent investment schemes and manage the money laundering. Walsh made a crucial error in the setup of one of the fake companies your husband invested in. He used his real social security number on a bank application. This information was exactly what the fraud investigators needed to trace Amanda's network. Dr. Lawson offered to share his private investigator's findings with the police and with Margaret Chen. Why would you help me? I asked. What do you get out of this? Justice, Dr. Lawson said simply. Amanda destroyed my marriage, my financial security, and my ability to trust anyone. If there's a chance to stop her from doing this to other families, I'm going to take it. That evening, I called Jessica to update her on Amanda's disappearance and the scope of the fraud that had been perpetrated against our family. Jessica listened in stunned silence as I explained how her father had been systematically manipulated and robbed. Mom, I feel so stupid. When I met Amanda, I thought she was perfect for Dad. She seemed so caring, so interested in making him happy. You weren't stupid, Jessica. Amanda is a professional. She spent years perfecting the art of deception. Your father fell for it, Dr. Lawson fell for it, and apparently several other successful men have fallen for it too. Is Dad going to be okay financially? It was a complicated question. David's business was still viable, but Amanda had managed to extract a substantial portion of his liquid assets. More importantly, the legal costs of fighting the divorce and pursuing fraud charges were mounting rapidly. I don't know. He's hired forensic accountants to assess the damage, and he's working with law enforcement to try to trace the stolen money. But even in the best-case scenario, he's lost several years' worth of earnings. What about you? Are you going to be okay? For the first time in months, I could answer that question with genuine confidence. Yes, I think I am. The evidence we've gathered about Amanda's fraud actually strengthens my case for recovering my pension money. And I've discovered that I'm stronger than I thought I was. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I owe you an apology. When Dad first told me about the divorce, I believed his version of events. I thought you were being unreasonable about accepting his new relationship. I should have trusted you more. You don't owe me an apology, Jessica. You were trying to maintain relationships with both of your parents during an impossible situation. That's exactly what you should have done. Can we have dinner this weekend? I want to hear more about what you've been going through, and I want you to meet some of the friends I've been talking to about this situation." The offer touched me more than Jessica could know. For months, I'd felt isolated and abandoned by my own family. The prospect of rebuilding our relationship felt like the first genuinely positive development since this nightmare began. A week later, Margaret Chen called with news that changed everything. The FBI had become involved in the Amanda Chen case, and their investigation had uncovered a fraud network operating across multiple states. They've identified at least 12 victims over the past 7 years, Margaret explained. Amanda and her partner Stephen Walsh have stolen over $8 million from successful men across the Southwest. $8 million? It's even more sophisticated than we initially realized. They research potential targets for months before making contact, gathering information about their finances, their personal lives, and their emotional vulnerabilities. Amanda specializes in men going through midlife crises or major life transitions. The FBI had managed to freeze several accounts associated with the fraud network, including offshore accounts that contained money stolen from previous victims. While most of Amanda's recent theft was probably gone forever, there was a possibility of partial recovery from the frozen assets. How much might we be able to recover? It's too early to say, but possibly as much as 30 to 40% of what was stolen from your family. It's not full restitution, but it's better than nothing. More importantly, the criminal case against Amanda and Stephen Walsh was proceeding rapidly. The FBI had enough evidence to issue federal warrants for fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. They're treating this as organized crime, Rebecca. When they catch Amanda and Walsh, they're looking at serious federal prison time. 2 weeks later, I received a call that brought the first phase of this ordeal to a close. Amanda Chen and Stephen Walsh had been arrested in Costa Rica, where they'd been attempting to establish residency under false identities. They were being extradited to face federal charges in Arizona. The news hit David particularly hard. He called me the evening after the arrests were announced on the local news. "I keep thinking about the emails she sent me," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "All those messages about finding my authentic self and living my truth. She was laughing at me the entire time, wasn't she?" "I don't think she was laughing, David. I think she was working. This was her job, and she was very good at it." "How do I face people now? Everyone's going to know that I was taken in by a con artist. My business partners, my employees, Jessica, everyone. You face them the same way I faced the possibility of losing everything because my husband stole my retirement money. You put one foot in front of the other and you rebuild." David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Becky, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance we could try to work things out? I know I've destroyed everything between us, but maybe if we went to counseling, maybe if I spent the rest of my life making it up to you." The question I'd been dreading had finally been asked. David was broken, financially devastated, and facing the reality that his grand romantic gesture had been a cruel deception. Now, he wanted to to come home to the stability and security he'd thrown away. "No, David," I said gently but firmly. "What we had is over. It ended the day you decided to steal from me to pay for another woman. Amanda being a con artist doesn't change what you did to me. But if we could start over, if we could rebuild our marriage on a more honest foundation. David, you stole $400,000 from my pension. You lied to me for 3 years. You introduced our daughter to your mistress behind my back. Those choices weren't Amanda's doing. They were yours. I was manipulated. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were manipulated about Amanda's intentions, but you weren't manipulated about the choice to steal from me. That was a conscious decision you made to prioritize your fantasy over my security." After hanging up with David, I sat in my small apartment and reflected on how much my life had changed in just 6 months. I'd gone from being a wife whose entire identity was tied to her marriage to being a single woman who was rebuilding her life from scratch. The apartment that had initially felt like a symbol of my displacement now felt like home. I decorated it with care, filled it with books and plants and artwork that reflected my personal taste, rather than compromise with someone else's preferences. I'd also started taking pottery classes at the community center and had joined a hiking group for people over 50. For the first time in decades, I was making friends based on shared interests rather than shared social obligations. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I enjoyed living alone. After 38 years of coordinating my schedule with someone else's needs and preferences, the freedom to make decisions based solely on my own desires felt revolutionary. My job at the hospital had become more fulfilling as well. Knowing that I was working to support myself rather than contributing to a household that was being systematically robbed made every shift feel meaningful and productive. The legal resolution of my case was still pending, but Margaret Chen was optimistic about the outcome. The criminal charges against Amanda had strengthened our civil case enormously, and David's attorney was now recommending that he settle rather than fight. "Your husband's legal team knows they're in an impossible position," Margaret explained. "They can't argue that the money transfers were legitimate business expenses when those same transfers are now evidence in a federal fraud case. The proposed settlement would return my full pension amount plus interest, as well as a substantial portion of the other assets David had transferred to Amanda. It wouldn't completely restore our family's financial position, but it would ensure my security in retirement." More importantly, I was learning to define security differently. Instead of depending on someone else's financial management and business success, I was building a life based on my own skills, interests, and relationships. The woman who had sat in shock at her kitchen table 6 months ago, learning that her marriage was over and her retirement savings had been stolen, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had been devastated by betrayal because her entire sense of self-worth was tied to being a good wife and mother. The woman I was becoming understood that her value wasn't determined by other people's choices or actions. I was worthy of respect and security regardless of whether my husband chose to honor his commitments or whether my daughter initially believed his version of events. As I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by evidence of the life I was building, for myself, I realized something remarkable had happened. I wasn't just surviving David's betrayal and Amanda's fraud. I was thriving in ways I never could have imagined when my identity was completely wrapped up in being half of a couple. The final chapter of this story was still being written, but for the first time in months, I was excited to see how it would end. 6 months after Amanda's arrest, I stood in the courthouse watching David sign the final divorce settlement. The man across the table looked nothing like the confident businessman who had casually announced he was leaving me for his soulmate. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines etched his face, and his expensive suits hung loosely on his diminished frame. The settlement was everything Margaret Chen had promised and more. I would receive my full pension amount plus 18 months of interest, totaling nearly $450,000. Additionally, David was transferring ownership of one of his dealerships to me, along with half of our remaining joint assets. This represents approximately 60% recovery of the assets that were fraudulently transferred, Margaret explained as we reviewed the final papers. Given the circumstances, it's an exceptional outcome. David's signature was shaky as he signed each page. His business had survived Amanda's theft, but barely. He'd been forced to sell 2 of his 4 dealerships to cover the losses and legal fees. The dealership he was transferring to me was actually his most profitable location, but keeping it would have meant filing for bankruptcy. The property comes with existing management contracts and a solid customer base, Margaret continued. You can choose to maintain ownership and collect the profits, or sell it for a substantial lump sum. I'd already decided to sell. At 63, I had no interest in learning the auto business, but the sale price would give me more than enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, plus the freedom to travel and pursue interests I'd deferred for decades. As we left the courthouse, David caught up with me in the parking lot. He looked like he wanted to say something but struggled to find the words. "Congratulations," he finally managed. "You deserve this outcome after everything I put you through." "Thank you," I replied simply. There was nothing left to say between us that hadn't already been said. "Jessica told me you're planning to travel." "I'm going to New Zealand next month. 3 weeks exploring both islands. After that, maybe Scotland or Ireland." "Alone?" "With a tour group initially, but yes, essentially alone. I'm looking forward to it." David nodded, though his expression suggested he couldn't understand how anyone would choose solitude over companionship. "If you ever need anything, financial advice or help with business decisions, I hope you'll call me." "I won't need anything, David. I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." He flinched at the implied criticism, but didn't argue. We parted ways in the courthouse parking lot, and I knew with certainty that it would be the last time we spoke as anything other than distant acquaintances sharing occasional family events. The criminal trial of Amanda Chen and Stephen Walsh had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Both had been convicted on multiple federal charges including fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Amanda received 12 years in federal prison, while Walsh got 15 years due to his prior criminal record. During the trial, the full scope of their operation had been revealed. Over 7 years, they had defrauded 23 victims across 6 states, stealing over $11 million. The FBI had recovered approximately $4 million from frozen accounts, which would be distributed among the victims through a complex restitution process. I attended several days of the trial, curious to see Amanda without her carefully constructed mask. The woman in the defendant's chair bore little resemblance to the polished life coach who had charmed my husband. Prison clothing and harsh fluorescent lighting revealed a hardness that her previous styling had concealed. When Amanda was asked to address the court before sentencing, she had remained defiant. "I helped these men recognize their own potential and break free from limiting relationships," she'd said. "If they chose to invest in their personal growth, that was their decision." Even facing prison time, Amanda couldn't acknowledge the devastation she'd caused. To her, the ruined marriages, depleted retirement accounts, and shattered families were simply the cost of helping men find themselves. The judge's response had been withering. "Ms. Chen, you are a predator who systematically targeted emotionally vulnerable individuals and stole their life savings. Your victims' financial security, family relationships, and ability to trust have been permanently damaged by your actions. The court finds no evidence of remorse or acceptance of responsibility." David had testified during the trial, describing how Amanda had manipulated him into believing his marriage was holding him back from achieving his potential. His testimony was painful to watch, not because I felt sympathy for him, but because it revealed how completely he'd lost sight of his own agency in the disaster. "She made me feel like I was finally living authentically," David had said on the witness stand. "She convinced me that my marriage was a cage I needed to escape from. What David still didn't understand was that Amanda hadn't made him do anything. She'd identified his weaknesses and desires, then provided him with a narrative that justified acting on impulses he'd already been feeling. The theft of my pension money hadn't been Amanda's idea originally. David had been moving assets long before he'd met her, preparing for an exit he'd been contemplating for years. Amanda had simply accelerated his timeline and given him a destination for the money he was stealing. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Richard Lawson appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, carrying a bottle of champagne and a bouquet of flowers. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said, when I answered the door. "I wanted to congratulate you on your settlement and thank you for your role in bringing Amanda to justice." I invited him in for coffee, and we spent the morning discussing the trial and the restitution process. Dr. Lawson had recovered about 30% of his losses through the FBI's asset seizure, enough to stabilize his retirement but not enough to fully repair the damage Amanda had caused. "The money isn't really the most important thing," he explained. "Knowing that Amanda is in prison and can't victimize anyone else, that's worth more than any financial recovery." As we talked, I found myself appreciating Dr. Lawson's perspective on rebuilding after betrayal. Unlike David, who remained focused on what he'd lost and how he'd been deceived, Dr. Lawson had used his experience as motivation to create a better life. "I've started a support group for people who've been victims of romance scams," he told me. "There are more of us than you might think, and the isolation can be as damaging as the financial loss." "What kind of support do you provide?" "Practical advice about financial recovery, legal resources, but mostly just the opportunity to talk with people who understand what you've been through. The shame and self-blame can be overwhelming if you don't have anyone to share it with." Dr. Lawson's support group met monthly at a community center in Scottsdale. He invited me to attend as a guest speaker, sharing my story with others who were dealing with similar situations. I was surprised by how therapeutic I found the experience. The group included men and women of all ages who had been targeted by various types of romance scams, from online dating fraud to elaborate long-term deceptions like Amanda's operation. "The thing that struck me most about Rebecca's story," Dr. Lawson told the group after I'd finished speaking, "is how she transformed from victim to investigator to advocate. She didn't just survive what happened to her, she took control of the situation and fought back." An elderly woman named Helen raised her hand. "How did you find the strength to fight? I feel so stupid about what happened to me that I can barely function." It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. Where had I found the courage to research Amanda's background, confront her directly, and pursue justice through the legal system? "I think the strength came from realizing that my identity wasn't dependent on my marriage or my husband's choices," I answered. "For 38 years, I'd defined myself as David's wife and Jessica's mother. When that identity was stripped away, I discovered that there was still a person underneath all those roles." "But weren't you terrified of being alone?" "I was terrified of everything. Being alone, being poor, being too old to start over. But I discovered that fear is just an emotion. It doesn't actually prevent you from taking action if you choose to act despite feeling afraid." After the support group meeting, several people approached me privately to share their stories and ask for advice. I realized that my experience, as painful as it had been, had given me knowledge and perspective that could help others. That evening, I called Jessica to tell her about the support group meeting. "Mom, you sound different, stronger somehow." "I feel different. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm living my own life instead of supporting someone else's." "Are you lonely?" "I worry about you living alone." It was a question everyone asked, and I understood why. Society assumes that living alone, especially as an older woman, must be a source of misery and isolation. What people didn't understand was how liberating solitude could be after decades of constantly accommodating someone else's needs and preferences. I'm not lonely, Jessica. I'm alone by choice, which is completely different from being lonely. I have friends, interests, activities. I just don't have anyone controlling my schedule or questioning my decisions. What about dating? Do you think you'll ever want to be in a relationship again? Maybe someday, but if I do, it will be as an addition to a life I already love, not as a solution to problems or insecurities. The New Zealand trip had been everything I'd hoped for and more. Traveling with a small tour group had provided the perfect balance of companionship and independence. I'd hiked through fjords, explored geothermal wonders, and spent hours photographing landscapes that took my breath away. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could navigate international travel, make friends with strangers, and handle unexpected challenges without panicking or needing someone to rescue me. In Queenstown, I'd gone bungee jumping for the first time in my life. As I stood on the platform, 63 years old and terrified but determined, I'd thought about all the fears I'd let control my choices over the years. Fear of David's disapproval, fear of financial insecurity, fear of being seen as selfish or demanding. The leap into empty space had felt like a physical representation of the emotional leap I'd been making since my divorce. For those few seconds of free fall, I'd experienced pure exhilaration, the joy of choosing courage over safety. When I'd returned from New Zealand, I'd decided to make some changes to my living situation. The small apartment had served its purpose during the crisis, but I was ready for a home that reflected my new life and priorities. I found a charming adobe house in central Phoenix with a large garden and space for a home office. The mortgage payment was easily affordable with my settlement money, and the location was perfect for walking to museums, restaurants, and cultural events. For the first time in my life, I decorated a space entirely according to my own taste. Bright colors, comfortable furniture, walls covered with photographs from my travels and artwork from local artists. Every room reflected my personality without compromise or negotiation. I also made the decision to reduce my hours at the hospital to part-time. At 63, with my financial security restored, I no longer needed to work full-time. Instead, I could focus on the aspects of nursing I most enjoyed while having time for other pursuits. The extra time allowed me to volunteer with Dr. Lawson's support group, helping other victims of financial fraud navigate the legal and emotional recovery process. I'd also started writing about my experience, sharing my story through articles and blog posts that reached people dealing with similar situations. 1 year after Amanda's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through the federal prison system. Amanda had written to me from her facility in Texas, apparently part of some rehabilitation program requirement. Dear Mrs. Martinez, the letter began, I have been encouraged by my counselors to reach out to the people I harmed during my criminal activities. I want you to know that I understand the pain I caused your family and that I take full responsibility for my actions. The letter continued for 2 pages, filled with therapeutic language about personal growth, accountability, and making amends. Amanda claimed to be using her time in prison to examine her behavior patterns and develop healthier ways of relating to others. I hope that someday you will be able to forgive me for the damage I caused to your marriage and financial security. I know that my actions contributed to the destruction of your family, and I deeply regret the pain I inflicted. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Amanda's apology felt as calculated and manipulative as everything else she'd done. She was still positioning herself as the central figure in my story, claiming credit for destroying my family as if David bore no responsibility for his choices. The truth was that Amanda hadn't destroyed my family. She'd revealed its existing weaknesses and accelerated its dissolution, but the foundation had been cracking for years before she appeared. More importantly, what Amanda saw as destruction, I had come to see as liberation. The end of my marriage had forced me to discover strengths and capabilities I'd never known I possessed. 2 years after my divorce, I celebrated my 65th birthday with a party in my garden. Jessica and her family were there, along with friends from work, my hiking group, the pottery class, and Dr. Lawson's support network. It was a gathering that represented the life I'd built for myself, filled with people who knew and valued me as an individual rather than as someone's wife or mother. David was not invited, though Jessica had asked if she should extend an invitation to him. I'd declined without hesitation. David was welcome at Jessica's events, and I would be cordial when our paths crossed. But my birthday celebration was about the life I'd created after our marriage ended. During the party, my granddaughter Lily presented me with a drawing she'd made. It showed me standing on a mountain peak, arms raised in victory, with the words, "Grandma's Adventure," written in purple crayon across the top. "This is you being brave," Lily explained seriously. "Mommy told me you learned how to be brave when things got scary." As I looked at the drawing, I realized that Lily had captured something essential about my journey. I hadn't started out brave. I'd started out terrified, betrayed, and convinced that my life was over. But fear and courage weren't opposites. They were companions, and learning to act despite fear had been the most valuable skill I'd ever developed. The final piece of my legal saga concluded that fall when I received a check for $47,000 from the Federal Victim Restitution Fund. It was my share of the assets recovered from Amanda and Stephen's criminal enterprise, money I'd never expected to see again. I decided to use the restitution money to establish a scholarship fund for non-traditional students returning to nursing school later in life. Women like myself who had put their education on hold for family responsibilities and were now ready to pursue their professional goals. The scholarship announcement attracted local media attention, and I found myself being interviewed about my experience and recovery. The reporter, a young woman in her 30s, asked me what advice I would give to other women facing similar betrayals. "Don't let anyone else define your worth or your future," I answered. "When someone betrays your trust, it says everything about their character and nothing about your value as a person. Focus on building a life you love instead of trying to fix a relationship with someone who doesn't deserve your energy." Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation? My only regret is that I didn't trust my instincts sooner. I knew something was wrong in my marriage for years before David asked for a divorce. I should have confronted the problems instead of hoping they would resolve themselves. What would you say to women who are afraid to leave unhappy marriages because they're worried about financial security? I'd say that financial insecurity is temporary, but wasting years of your life in a relationship that doesn't serve you is permanent. You can rebuild your finances, but you can't get back time you've spent being unhappy. As I sat in my garden that evening, reviewing the newspaper article about my story, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just 3 years. The woman who had been devastated by her husband's betrayal had evolved into someone who was helping other people navigate similar challenges. I'd discovered that healing wasn't about returning to who I'd been before the trauma. It was about becoming someone new, someone stronger and more self-aware than I'd ever imagined I could be. David had remarried 6 months earlier, a quiet ceremony, with a woman he'd met at a business conference. Jessica had attended the wedding and reported that David seemed genuinely happy with his new wife, a widow in her 50s who ran her own accounting firm. I felt no jealousy or bitterness about David's new relationship. If anything, I was relieved that he'd found someone who could provide the companionship he'd been seeking when he destroyed our marriage. His happiness or lack thereof was no longer my responsibility. My own life was full of possibilities I'd never considered during my decades as a wife and mother. I was planning a trip to Ireland for the spring, considering taking a creative writing class, and exploring the possibility of expanding Dr. Lawson's support group into a nonprofit organization. At 65, I was discovering interests and capabilities I'd never had time to explore. The woman who had once defined herself solely through her relationships with others had learned to value her own company and trust her own judgment. The final irony of my story was that Amanda's betrayal had been the catalyst for the most authentic and fulfilling period of my life. In trying to destroy my financial security and family stability, she'd actually freed me from a life that had been slowly suffocating my spirit. I'd traded a marriage based on habit and obligation for a life based on choice and personal growth. I'd exchanged financial dependence for true security that came from my own capabilities and resources. Most importantly, I'd learned that strength wasn't about enduring whatever life threw at you, but about actively creating the life you wanted to live. As the sun set over my garden, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I raised a glass of wine to toast the journey that had brought me here. To betrayal that led to freedom, to endings that became beginnings, and to the discovery that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.